This is AP, and I'm asking, has anybody read it before? And Finley was getting ready to say something.
I've read the, like, I don't know how to say it. It's like a concise version.
Yeah.
It's one of those ones that's meant for kids. It's been, like, a lot of parts of it have been taken out and narrowed down.
Sure.
It's a really short book.
That's a legitimate thing to do. I just don't think as a young kid, you could appreciate it. It'd be hard to read, too, with the dialect. So I'm glad you're able to read it.
Isn't it about, like, a kid running away, going down, like, a boat on a river raft, something
Yes,
like that?
with an escaped slave.
Yeah.
Anybody else remember anything about it? Yeah. A lot of people get it confused with Tom Sawyer. Tom Sawyer was written first. You'll find out in a minute. Tom Sawyer was written 8 years before Huck Finn was published. Let me put it this way. Tom Sawyer was published 8 years before Huck Finn was published. They contain many of the same characters, but they're two very different books. It is this. That used to be a thing, like used to say when I was growing up, anybody can become president because look at Lincoln. You know, he grew up in a log cabin. Everybody can become president. Not sure that's true, but I mean, ideally, theoretically, it's true. This other thing is sort of a myth in a way, but will you grow up to write the great American novel? That was sort of a thing, you know, like somebody, might be you, well, this is considered by some people the great American novel. So that tells you something about its value. I'm leaving that on because I think people who watch this can see the screen better. These are some questions that I want to be able to answer. How important is it? I've already given you a clue. Some people say it's the great American novel. Why have we been reading it for 150 years? We've been reading Shakespeare for 450 years. What is it about great books? Remember, Thoreau gave us a clue when he said that a classic is the classics are the most noble recorded thoughts of man. They're the noble thoughts of man. And so that's one reason why we still read it, because it's got the best thoughts that people have had. It's important, which we'll do in a minute. Yes, sir.
What would you say is your favorite classic of all time?
Well, this one ranks right up there. This is an American classic. I've said my favorite book in college, because it helped change my life, was The Brothers Karamazov, which is by Dostoevsky. But the greatest books really are the poems, you know, like Paradise Lost, which you read last year. So I've just given you two of the books that we study. I think the Paradise Lost is really, I never took a class on it, I just read it. Anyway, thank you. That's a good question. You could ask all your teachers. What are the books that have changed your life? We talked about that. Thoreau motivated us to ask you, what are the 5 greatest books you've ever read? All right, so to know Mark Twain helps you understand the book. So that's why we're going to go there. There are problems with the book. Like the fact that it's about race. You notice All the King's Men was not about race. I kind of thought the first time I read it, oh, this is going to be a book show you how tough race was, racial relationships and racism. That was never really the issue in that book. It is here. And so it's the way he handles that topic. The N word is profuse in the book. You see it all the time. You forget it's there. It's kind of like some words we hear today that start with certain letters that are they're so common that people will say it when they're happy. They'll say it when they're joking. They'll say it when they're mad. I mean, these certain words, they're profanity, but they're used so often we don't even hear them anymore. You know, we don't even think twice. I think the N word for Mark Twain's generation was the same thing. But Mark Twain was not racist. At least the book is not. he's trying to show how bad racism is by using that word. So there's several things there. There's several themes that you need to know. This is a realistic book, not a romantic book, and that's the theme of the book. That realism is superior to romanticism. Romanticism is bad. And the book makes fun of romanticism. And it shows how realistic people are actually better people. That sounds like a crazy thing to say, but it's true from his point of view. And then the fact that Huck Finn is the narrator, that changes it completely from Tom Sawyer. Huck Finn was in Tom Sawyer and vice versa. But they're two very different books. This is just another introductory statement. You know who Ernest Hemingway is? You'll read him next year in Dr. Betzel's class. He was a modern American writer. He said, all modern literature, American literature, comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There's nothing before it. There's been nothing as good since. I mean, that says what a lot of people think about this book, is it's the best book ever produced by an American. Nothing but the best for Colin. All right, so here's some background. I think knowing something about his background is important. I could give you a test on this. We definitely need to write a paper. Again, we can't write enough, and we can't read enough poetry. Those three things: can't read enough, can't write enough, and particularly can't read enough poetry. Those three things. All right, he was born in 1835. He died in 1910. Doesn't that make him 75 years old? So he lives for 75 years. Did you know his real name? Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Could you have told me his real name? My generation knew his real name as well as we did his pen name. He was born in Florida, Missouri. He was born in Missouri, at a place called Florida, Missouri. And then he moved to Hannibal, Missouri with his family. And Hannibal is the site of Tom Sawyer and the opening chapters of Huck Finn. Hannibal is St. Petersburg. That's what Mark Twain calls it in Tom Sawyer. The greatest thing a kid could become, I don't know what that would be today, probably a professional athlete is probably every boy wants to grow up to be that at some point. It may not last very long, but a lot of people want to do that. Well, in Mark Twain's day, being a riverboat pilot was the dream of every young boy. And that was because they lived right there on the river. It was like living next to a highway or an airport. You know, that was just a part of your life, back and forth, up and down the river. And to be a pilot on board one of those, the one who navigated and steered it along the Mississippi, was the dream of, and he became that. I think it's funny that he spent 2 years in the Civil War, and he didn't even see any combat. He and his brother joined a volunteer unit on the Confederate side and didn't want it anymore. They left. Now this is a volunteer unit. It's not like they were drafted by the United States government. You can't just walk away from that. But apparently you can with a volunteer unit. And the fact that his name is Mark Twain. Do any of you know the origins of that name? Yeah, exactly. It's a nautical term on the river. They would measure the depth of the river because the river could get, particularly during droughts and things, it could get so low that you could rip the bottom out of the boat. And so they had to constantly, at places, measure the depth of the river, fathom the depth. And so they would lower a stick or a rope that had something on knots or marks. And if they got to the number 2 mark, I don't know what that represented, feet, I don't know what it was, but that means it was clear sailing. It was deep enough to sail. And so you'd hear all over the river, Mark Twain, you'd hear that just turn, it was just common, that measure it, it's at 2. The interesting thing about it, before he became famous, there was another man writing articles in the newspapers and being published all over the Midwest who used the title Mark Twain. So our Mark Twain wasn't the first Mark Twain or the only Mark Twain, except when our Mark Twain adopted it, nobody else could use it anymore because our Mark Twain became famous. So I think that's an interesting history of that word. His publishing history starts in 1865. He published the short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. Anybody ever read it or heard of it? It's a story about a con man being conned. That was one of his favorite themes, is con men. If you lived in America during the 1860s, particularly outside the big cities, I think con men were just a part of the culture. People always trying to cheat you out of something. You had to be very careful. Anyway, it made him famous. It was published in a newspaper. He went on to write, and this isn't an exclusive list. I have another list coming. But Innocents Abroad, it was really a travel book. And he actually traveled in the 1860s to Europe and to the Promised Land. Or, I don't know what they call it back in Palestine, maybe. Israel didn't exist as a nation. And it's one of the funniest things I've ever read. I read it for a course. If you don't laugh out loud at some point when you read Huck Finn, then you're not reading it very well. Because even though it may not be your kind of humor, it's very kind of low-key. If you read it carefully, you'll see the humor in it. And that's what you get with Innocents Abroad. Tom Sawyer was published in 1876 and Huck Finn in 1884. And it may surprise you that he died in Connecticut. He spent most of his adult life in Connecticut. He bought a huge mansion there that still exists, and he named it Stormfield, which was after a character in one of his books. So he did most of the writing of his life in Connecticut, not Missouri. So he's 75. One interesting sidebar to that is the year he was born, Halley's, we used to call it, I think it's called Halley's Comet now, made a pass through our atmosphere. Not, I don't know how close it gets, but it keeps doing this thing every 7,500 years. Well, that passed through the year he was born. It passed through again the year that he died. A lot of people saw some significance in that. I don't know what. But, I mean, the picture of Mark Twain, I don't know if you can see this right here. That is the image he tried to cultivate. It was a marketing thing. I don't know what he would have looked like without it, but the white hair, the vanilla suit, the ice vanilla color suit, the mustache, usually has a cigar or a pipe, I don't know which it is. But he wanted to give this impression of a Southern gentleman. And it was kind of a, this sounds completely irrelevant, but you know who Dolly Parton is? I read or heard one time that Dolly Parton would sleep in her makeup and do her hair. She never appeared anything but what you see and what you've seen of her on stage or anything. She was so conscious of her image that she would never allow herself to look any different. And so I think that's kind of sad that these people become so intertwined with their image that they become that person. All right, so here I've divided as we finish up. I think, let me see how much time we have. 1:55, so we've got just a few minutes. I've divided the biography into two parts, his triumphs and his tragedies. So let's look for the next 5 minutes at his triumphs. He wrote 25 books. Here are some of them. Prince and the Pauper, one of his favorite themes was the switched identity, the, what do you call it? People exchange identities. If you're a fan of, I know some of you guys probably like to watch the Hallmark Christmas channel, you'll see about 10 or 12 movies that have switched at Christmas, this princess switch, or whatever. They're all into this. They're kind of silly, but it's a legitimate plot idea, because he used it. Life on the Mississippi is nonfiction. I really like that. I read it for a class. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, he takes on time travel. A Connecticut Yankee ends up traveling to medieval England during the Knights of the Round Table and interacting with people. And then finally, one of my favorite of his books, but also very dark, very short. You could read it overnight, probably. It's called Pudd'nhead Wilson. And I used to teach that, and I would show a movie that was made about 30 years ago. Very good movie of Pudd'nhead Wilson. I showed it to my wife one time, brought it home, we video, whatever it was in those days. And we got to the very end, and she said, I can't watch it. And it was something so sad that she couldn't watch it. And I won't go into details, but it's a dark story. It's about switched identities. A slave switches her son with the master's son. And because she was 1/32nd African, she looked completely white, and so her child looked white, and so she switched them, and so the master's boy grows up to be the slave, and the slave son grows up to be the master. It's brilliant because it shows you what we're dealing with right now is that the color of your skin doesn't matter. It's how you're raised, and it's your innate ability. And this is a book that kind of, you forget who's black and who's white. Because even the black person's not really black, and the white person's not really white. It's just, he just confuses that to make his point that it doesn't matter. And yet, culture makes it matter a great deal. I really recommend it. It's really an entertaining book. He wrote a lot of other things too. So you couldn't, I don't know, you could ever read all of what Mark Twain wrote. 25 books. Yeah, I've read a lot of them. I don't know, and a lot of for classes that I had to read, but I'm glad I did. And how about, we got still a few more minutes. These are the tragedies. He outlived his entire family. His wife, his daughters, 2 of them, and his son. So that's bound to turn you into something dark. Because I don't think he was a believer. It'd be even hard for believers to deal with that. He went bankrupt. He had invested a lot of his money in a new design for a printing press. But before he could get it patented, somebody patented it, almost the identical scheme. And so he lost all the money he had put into the developing of it and went bankrupt. By the way, what helped him, what he ended up doing is once he got back on his feet, he published the autobiography of Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant, it's really one of the most popular, that sounds like the last person in the world, most people today don't even know who he is, and the last person they'd want to read about. But it was very, very popular in the 1870s, Grant was. And to Grant's credit, he was dying of cancer, and he willed himself to finish the book, which became this huge success, so his family wouldn't go into bankruptcy. That makes me think a lot of Grant. And then finally, because of some of the dark things that happened to him, Twain developed a cynical, deterministic philosophy. He was really, his view of life is pretty dark. I read a unpublished, it was published in the 60s, called Life with the Indians. and it's about him and Tom Sawyer going west to kind of live with Indians and experience that. And it's a very dark story. The Indians are not nice people in this book. They're very cruel. And so he kind of developed this really kind of dark view of human nature. So all those things happen. But we're not ready to go yet. Don't leave us yet. All right, so I just gave you your book. Everybody have one, right? You need to read the first 10 chapters by next Wednesday. It's 60 pages. That puts us maybe a quarter of the way through the book. So you need to read the first 10 chapters by next Wednesday. You know, we're pretty faithful in taking quizzes, so you need to make sure you do read it. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. It's not a book that you can read out loud easily for a lot of reasons, so not that you need that. It's a lot easier for you to read it. So you may do so.